You're about to listen to a conversation between me, Milo, and Robert Alter. Robert Alter is a literature professor of, I think, comparative literature and Hebrew is his job title. And in the autumn of his years, he almost incidentally and by accident translated the entire Hebrew Bible. Immediately after we talked to him, Milo texted me to say, he doesn't seem like the kind of man who translated the entire Hebrew Bible. He was surprisingly casual about the whole affair.
Which is very true, despite the fact he's achieved one of the great feats of translation in our time. It
Yeah.
was um, it was just achieved because of its success. He did Genesis, didn't want to do anything else. The baying crowds demanded Samuel. He did Samuel, didn't want to do anything
The
else.
baying crowds demanded Chronicles and Leviticus.
He had no choice.
Strapped to the desk.
Had
Yeah.
to write the whole damn thing.
I just
Yeah.
imagine a crowd with pitchforks and torches outside of Robert Alter's apartment
We
window.
need the
We
medieval
want
chapter
Job.
divisions.
We want Job.
You've got to leave the Deuteronomist. We like
Yeah.
him.
We need Amos.
And they got Amos, but they wanted
Yeah.
more.
He was probably the most acute 90-year-old I've ever spoken to in my life. Immediately after the call, I sort of double checked his age, and yeah, it's 90. Just because, he really speaks in full grammatically correct sentences. I,
Very on the ball,
yeah, I think.
perhaps due to his early dreams of being a ball game player.
And his continued tennis. I think
Yeah,
he's a great advert for tennis and the wonderful things tennis can do to your brain longevity.
there's no other explanation.
I think Robert Alter will live till a really weird age. I think Robert
Yeah,
Alter will be 120, you know, looking back. His Bible
yeah,
translation was actually just the middle of his life.
yeah. His second translation was
Yeah,
interesting
yeah.
of the Hebrew Bible again. He just thought,
Just yeah, I didn't really nail it that first
yeah,
time. I just
Leviticus wasn't quite singing. And you can't redo Leviticus and leave the rest of the
Yeah, yeah,
Pentateuch, and you can't
exactly.
do the Pentateuch, and then
If I've done the
so
Pentateuch, yeah. Come to think
I
of
didn't
it,
intend to
that
retranslate the
yeah,
whole Bible, but one thing led to another.
a few of the names in Chronicles I got wrong, and I thought.
What the hell?
Now I think of it, the 22nd Psalm also.
And when you've done, the 22nd, you think the 21st,
Ah,
20th, 19th, you're on a roll. Can't help it.
uh,
Or maybe he could translate Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible
no,
back into Hebrew
yeah.
and then see how that goes.
Yeah, in the future, the only existing Bible translation that we have is my translation of Robert Alter's Hebrew translation of Robert Alter's English translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's all future generations will get.
And like the Septuagint, they'll love it. They'll be like, "This is great.
This is the real one.
This
Yeah,
is well, like the KJV only guys who think that the King James version is the most true Bible.
yeah. I think that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some translations that must be superior to the original. I mean, I can't imagine the original Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam tops the Fitzgerald Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I met a Persian guy who was very spoke very highly of Omar Khayyam, but
There's
it
the
might have just been a jingoistic thing, like
Ezra, Ezra Pound, maybe his Chinese stuff, but the Chinese stuff is pretty good. So I
yeah,
don't
the
know.
Chinese stuff's good in every translation. I don't, there's not, there's, you can't
Yeah,
do badly by.
and based on how Chinese works, I can only imagine it's incomparably better in Chinese because you can just read it backwards and it's another
Yeah,
poem.
yeah, exactly.
Can't
Yeah,
really do that in
yeah.
English.
Syntax. uh,
Maybe the Chinese translation of all great literature is just better. It's
yeah.
the best language. It's the best one.
The Chinese translation of the Hebrew Bible is 4 words, but it's all in there.
Yeah, they've just got
Yes.
the tetragrammaton and they've just like,
Yeah.
there it is. There it is. God intended
That's
it to be written in
yeah.
Chinese, and it
Yeah.
took a long time to get there.
It's
But
just a geographical problem. And when you consider the size of the universe, it makes sense that
he nearly got there. It's
Yahweh
pretty
would
close.
miss. Yeah.
The whole universe got
Yeah.
Israel not far,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
cosmically speaking. Basically, on
On the
the head of
ball.
the needle.
Yeah.
You just slightly wrong bit of the head of the needle.
Hmm. Great. Thank you so much for joining us, Robert
Happy to
Alter.
be here.
We usually start these chats with a poetic epigraph, and I was looking around for which one would be appropriate, and then it occurred to me that one of the most famous sonnets in the English language is about reading a work in translation, namely Keats' On Looking into Chapman's
All
Homer.
right.
Um, which I'll just read now. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told that deep-browed Homer ruled at his demesne. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then I felt like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. My first question was actually just a brief biographical one, if I may. You were born in New York City in the middle of the Great Depression and like FDR's first term. What was the your childhood like? What sort of cultural milieu did you grow up in? And how did you
Well,
discover your love for reading?
to begin with, because of the Great Depression, my family, like many families in the United States, were ardent believers in Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal.
Hmm.
Um, we moved to Albany when I was 7 years old,
Hmm.
Albany, New York. And my memories of my first 7 years are fairly hazy. However, there was one that stuck in my mind that has to do with reading.
Hmm.
When I was 5 years old, before I knew how to read, my mother and my parents were not educated. My father had just 8 grades of schooling, and my mother just high school. And there weren't a lot of books in the house. However, when I was 5, she had very good instincts, my mom. She took me to the public library, got me a library card, which I was very proud of, and then sat with me looking at books that were probably large format picture books, fairy tales, or something like that. And she may have read one or two of the stories to me. That imprinted itself on me. I suddenly had this sense that there was this magical world of books that I wanted to enter. And within a couple of years, I became an addicted reader.
Hmm. Do you remember your first sort of profound aesthetic delight in a book?
Well, let's see. The first books that I remember reading were books about kids. Like there was an early 20th century author, I think he was American, named Booth Tarkington, a wonderfully wasp name. And he wrote a series of books about a kid named Penrod. Uh, and I read these avidly, um, not noticing, by the way, I discovered this much later when I was an adult, that there were anti-Semitic bits in the books, and not actually understanding all the words. I
Mm,
would pick them up by context as I went along. So I wouldn't say that reading Booth Tarkington changed my life in any way. but it did uh, open up to me the excitement of reading.
Mm.
Then, when I was, 8, 9, 10, I got very involved in sports. So I read a series of books about baseball players and football players, and that was very exciting to me. John R. Tunis was the author, um, and this may sound a little surprising, but I would say from the age of 8 to 18, the most important thing, my highest peak of ambition was to become an athletic star.
Mm.
And since Albany was a kind of small town, I was actually able to do that. That is, by my senior year in high school, I was a starting halfback on my high school football team. That's American football, of
Yeah.
course. And I was city champion in the sprints.
All right.
So that was uh, what animated me together with reading in my early years.
Mhm. So the way we're probably going to structure the rest of this interview is sort of a half-half, with Milo sort of taking the Bible half, and me taking the Nabokov, and we'll hopefully the
Yeah.
transition will be seamless, and there
Well,
will be lots of
maybe, yeah.
overlap between the two. But I'll hand over to Milo now to talk a bit about the Bible to begin with.
Hello, Robert.
Good
So
morning.
I've reread the books of Samuel in your translation. It's the first time I've read your translation of them. And reading just some of your commentary, I was reminded of a little note by a critic called Effie Langham, who is writing about Coriolanus. And I've seen this quoted in an introduction. I've never been able to actually track down the article it was written in or the context of the quote, but I've always thought it was wonderful. It's this very simple line: what happens to Coriolanus happens twice, which I thought was extremely insightful, really changed my understanding of the play. Just such a simple understanding of the events. And I was reminded because in the story of David, there is this tendency for everything to happen twice. And you mentioned in the commentary that many scholars put this down to kind of conflicting or competing traditions, which have both been written in, which is standard in certain biblical texts. We remember the first chapters of Genesis, we get two creation stories. There are many other examples. And
Sure.
even in the David story, you sort of acknowledge we get two origin stories for David. We get him
Right.
as the lyre player, and then we get him as the giant slayer, and the attempt to merge them
As you, uh,
together.
Yeah.
But elsewhere, where competing traditions, you believe that in fact it's a literary of a dramatic technique, and it isn't simply the fact that we're repeating the same information in a different way, but that it's meaningful. And I'm curious about, what does it mean for David, and what does it mean for the book of Samuel, that it says the same thing twice so frequently?
Well, I'll offer an example having to do with Saul. And the Saul story moves seamlessly into the David story with the conflict between the two of them. At the beginning of the Saul story, the prophet Samuel sends Saul off and tells him he's going to meet a band of prophets. These are not like Isaiah and Jeremiah, but they're kind of wandering ecstatics.
mhm.
And he comes upon the band, and they are playing musical instruments and dancing, perhaps singing, and it's a technique for inducing ecstasy. And
Mhm.
he enters into that experience And as Samuel has told him, he becomes another man. It's part of his transformation from a farmer boy to king. And at the end of the story, we have a little ideological tag, which is uh, that is why people say, is Saul too among the prophets? Which seems to be an anomaly. That's what they're saying. Now, at the end of the story, we at the end of the Saul narrative, or near the end, when he has been warned by Samuel that God is divesting the kingship from him, he again encounters a band of prophets and goes into ecstasy and writhes on the ground, lies on the ground all night long, stripping off all his clothing, which is a kind of expression of his divestiture as monarch. And then again, you have this tag. Therefore, do people say, is Saul too among the prophets? Now, this might look like a stumbling repetition, uh, two different stories stitched together. But if you look at their function in the larger narrative, the first version gives you the conferring of kingship on Saul, and the second version gives the stripping away of kingship. So it's rather artful, I think.
Do you think maybe the scholarship are frightened of beauty in that way? And that if a thing can be explained simply by well, it's a repetition. Clearly, we've got two traditions here. People aren't taking the aesthetics into account enough when regarding a text, mainly for its theological importance. Is that possible?
Well, here's how I look at it. The um, traditional believers over the ages, of course, thought of the Bible as a unitary text. When uh, academic scholarship, quote, scientific scholarship of the Bible came to the fore in 19th century Germany, there was a push to reconsider all such assumptions. And one of the impulses was, I think, quite justified to say, well, this is actually a composite text. It's a stitching together of different sources. And I don't resist that. Like, I think that the first four books of the Pentateuch are definitely a composite of the J source, the E source, and the P source. But in the impulse to resist traditional ways of looking at all this and to be what the scholars thought was scientific, they look past the possibility that not invariably, but in a good many instances, the combination of sources was quite purposeful.
So the essence of it, they were aiming for an aesthetic or a meaningful effect in the combination. So it wasn't merely that they thought, well, we have these two Genesis stories and we ought to report both of them. But
Just
rather they're in,
randomly.
yeah, we've got to get it all in there. We've got to put it in the box. But rather that to combine them is in fact to say a third thing, and that to have David as the lyre player and David as the Goliath slayer isn't just to have two stories that don't quite blend, but two halves of the same character. And maybe we see these things too historically and too firmly.
Yeah, that's aptly stated. That is, there of course is a contradiction between the two introduction of David's stories, since in the first one, at the end of that story, he has become a kind of music therapist for Saul. He plays the lyre to him
Mhm.
when he has these fits of mania. In the second story, um, at the end of it, after the slaying of Goliath, uh, Saul turns to his general Joab and says, "Who is this kid?" Now, of course, that makes no sense because he's supposedly been in the court for some time. Uh, so I think the editorial process was such that they had these two different stories. I think the Goliath story is probably a good deal later, and felt they couldn't tamper with the details of the story as they had found it. Uh, so they put one after the other, even though there are contradictions. But as you quite rightly say, these represent two aspects of David. On the one hand, he's the sweet singer of Israel, as the King James Version phrases it, and he uh, has a certain dominion over the realm of spirits. And the second one, he's a warrior hero.
Mhm. I
Yeah, there seems. Oh, go
Yeah,
on.
maybe something about this way it's composed is one of the reasons why David feels like the roundest character in the entire narrative Hebrew Bible. He feels like the human being with the most dimensions, perhaps precisely because he has internal contradictions. It's not as if Jacob or some of the prophets like Elias or Elisha are completely unambiguous figures, but David definitely has the most ambiguity lathered on him, the most overlapping narratives that aren't necessarily mutually reconcilable.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would add the following. Um, the narrative follows David's changing through time,
Hmm.
which you don't find anywhere else in ancient narrative, except in the Hebrew Bible and the Jacob story as well. That is, at the beginning, he's this beautiful young man who exerts a kind of charisma, and he's repeatedly the object of the verb love. The people love him, women love him, and so forth. Um, then he becomes a kind of savvy practitioner of realpolitik as he moves to the kingship. Uh, then he becomes, in a way, a victim, I would even say, to his ruthless general Joab. And at the end of the story, you don't see anything like this elsewhere, as I say, in ancient narrative. You see poor old David, impotent, shivering in bed, and probably mentally befuddled.
Yeah. Um, it's almost like it reminded me this time reading it through of The Godfather for some reason. I think Al
No, me,
Pacino is,
me
yeah.
too. Me too. The last chapters of well, the first chapters of Kings, which you I think rightly say the last chapters of the David story. You have, he whispers his deathbed demand, kill these three
Yeah,
people, and
yeah.
then you get the montage sequence at the end of the first Godfather film in which
Yeah.
Al Pacino becomes King Solomon and all of his rivals are executed in what I think is quite a cinematic form in the text. It's quite briefly and sharply executed. You get the one and the next and the other. And I didn't miss in the commentary the Godfather is referenced directly a few times. There are a few offers that can't be refused.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. That is the the oral will and testament that he delivers on his deathbed to Solomon is a hit list. He names two principal enemies and says, "You are a wise man, Solomon. You will know what to do." And Solomon's wisdom there is not like the wisdom of the two women who claim that the infant is their baby, but which is legendary. But it's the wisdom of how a person knows how to take care of his enemies. And an amusing thing about that, this is definitely an editorial um, intervention. After David names Joab and Shimei as the people that Solomon needs to take out, um, there is suddenly this speech in which David says to Solomon, and you shall walk in the ways of the Lord, and
Yeah.
you shall serve him with all your soul and with all your might. And it's a string of formulas from the book of Deuteronomy.
Mm.
And clearly, the editor, who was a Deuteronomist, couldn't quite stomach the Capo de Mafia, David, and so he plugged in this pious speech to try to counterbalance it.
Mm.
Yeah, I noticed. I mean, it's I guess standard affair for biblical commentaries to note where there are interpolations or possible interpolations in different traditions. And I noticed the sort of the spite and rage whenever the Deuteronomist interpolated because it ruins the story in a way. It sort
It
of
does.
undermines the drama. And I wonder if there was ever a temptation, and perhaps this is truly absurd to suggest, but a temptation simply to remove the Deuteronomist, to try and restore the book of Samuel as you identify it, book one, two, and the beginning of Kings, in a kind of purified narrative, or is that a completely ludicrous suggestion?
Well, it's a tempting idea. I mean, I could see a special edition of the David story, which would eliminate any Deuteronomistic intervention. But of course, uh, the interventions, the later editings, are part of the Hebrew Bible, and everybody wants to see the Hebrew Bible as it was passed down to us.
Yeah. You said that the David story is unique in ancient story for showing a human life through time and the changes over time. How late does one have to go before one sees equivalent forms arriving in world literature or European Mediterranean literature at any rate?
That's a good question. As far as I can recall, it doesn't really happen until the advent of the novel.
Goodness, wow. Yeah.
I mean, um, there are great narratives which are great without doing this.
Mm,
Boccaccio, Chaucer, and so forth.
mm. And even in the ancient tradition, Homer's Odyssey, I mean, Odysseus just remains the same human being,
Exactly. Yeah.
irrespective of whatever happens to him. I suppose in the Far Eastern tradition, you get those proto novels, things like the Tale of Genji, where someone
Yeah.
changes. But yeah, in the European tradition, it is amazing that millennia pass between between this David story, between this way of showing a human life, and it being picked up again with the advent of the novel across Europe. Why do you think that is? Why do you think uh, human, I suppose, European or Mediterranean, North African culture um, backs away from this representation of a whole human life for so long?
Well, I think I don't have a pat answer for that. Uh, but tentatively, I would say something like this, that the the major form of long narratives in, let's say, the ancient Mediterranean
Hmm.
is epic. And in the epic, you have these figures who embody certain memorable traits, and that is what the epic bard wants to present to his audience, not anything evolving. So Odysseus is always wily Odysseus, mentor is wise mentor, and so forth.
Well, I think this is an interesting transition point I can bring in because preparing for this interview, rereading the books of Samuel, I also read for the first time Nabokov's Pale Fire, which was an interesting experience because when one reads Robert Alter's Hebrew Bible, one also reads Robert Alter's commentary. When one reads Nabokov's Pale Fire, he reads not only John Shade's poem Pale Fire, but Charles Kinbote's commentary on Pale Fire,
Right.
which in both cases the commentary seems to be longer than the base text. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say Robert Alter is Charles Kimbote, it was
I hope
nonetheless
not.
an interesting experience of seeing the text related upon constantly throughout and being a kind of a balance between the commentary and the text throughout. For instance, the references to The Godfather struck me as maybe slightly unusual in the scope of standard biblical commentary, but it's a benefit because you come from a background slightly different from the standard biblical commentator.
Definitely.
Much as Charles Kinbote was not the standard editor of Shadian poetry in the world of Nabokov, but a particular note drew my attention, and this being the one to the revelation of the misprint, Mountain Fountain, in the dream that the dream of death that
Right.
is in Pale Fire, and how important that misprint is. In that it's first extremely significant that it is a fountain for a fountain. Then it becomes insignificant because it was just a slip of the typist. But then again, it becomes extremely significant because it seems to represent some power beyond all powers who's intervening in the lives of men. And in the note that Kinbote attaches to this idea, he mentions about how a foreign translator for the poem will really struggle to express that mountain for fountain difference in just one letter. But when describing that trouble, he uses this example of English and Russian, where a kind of two consecutive misprints could be represented in English and Russian just by changing one letter
It's
each
like
time.
crown, crow,
Crow,
cow, I
cow.
think. Yeah.
Yeah. One of these kind of miracles of, I mean, one of the least likely possible things imaginable in language. And people often focus on the untranslatable when we talk about translation. What can you not say? So I'd like to ask, particularly in your translation of the Hebrew Bible, and maybe the story of David in particular, what were some things that were extremely easy to translate, some shocking happenstances where the English and the Hebrew seem to rhyme? One lends itself to the other.
Well, before I address that question, I have to say about Pale Fire that Nabokov wrote it after he had done this rather literal translation of Pushkin and then written his own massive commentary. So
Okay.
it was, in a way, a kind of satirization of the genre that he'd just been engaged in. And also, to put a certain distance between myself and the character Kinmode, he is seriously deranged, very delusional. He's convinced himself that he's the deposed King Charles X of the kingdom of Zembla and so on and so forth. And also, he does not have the information that an informed commentator would have. That is, when he comes across the word Homer in the text, which refers to a round the base hit in baseball.
Mm.
He thinks it refers, he doesn't know anything about baseball, so he thinks it refers to the author of the Iliad.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, uh, okay, things that are easy to translate. Well, uh, in a way, I think that the narrative prose, once I built up a certain momentum for translating it by doing Genesis. At the beginning, I thought I was going to do only Genesis.
Mm.
So after a while, I got to have a sense that I had found a way in English to convey something of how the Hebrew moved. And maybe two particular instances would be the syntax. That is like the King James Version. Maybe even more extremely than the King James Version. I followed the parataxis, that is the parallel structures of syntax in the Hebrew. And
That's the
the other was,
and.
yeah, right,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
exactly. Yeah.
Uh, you know, I got a letter from when my Genesis came out from a Bible scholar I had been friendly with, he tried to be tactful, but he obviously hated my translation. And one of the things he said was that um, English can't tolerate uh, and like that the way Hebrew can. So I wrote back that, well, I think that there are some splendid examples in English literature of parataxis, that is Hemingway, who was, of course, influenced by the King James Version, and then Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of Joyce's Ulysses, which is and. Oh, okay. So that was one happy connection between the English and the Hebrew. And then the diction of the narrative, this is it's different for the poetry, in the Hebrew is pointedly simple. It's a kind of basic Hebrew. And then the writers managed to give that a certain eloquence. And I found it wasn't hard to follow that in the English. Now, let me see if I can think of a term that, okay. Um, in translating Psalm 30, uh, at the end of the psalm, the speaker, who apparently has had a grave illness from which he's recovered, says, uh, addressing God, um, I'm going to translate it literally for a moment. Uh, you have turned my keening or mourning, something like that, into a song for me. I'm sorry, to a dance for me. Now, the Hebrew uses a pointed alliteration. The word for a chant of mourning is misped, and the word for dance is machol. So they both begin with an M sound, and that's purposeful because it demonstrates on the level of sound how God is capable of flipping something into its opposite.
Mm.
So then I thought for a moment and I said, wait a minute. There is a good word, a nice monosyllabic word in English that means a chant of mourning, and that's dirge. You have turned my dirge to a dance for me. And I was very happy about that.
Beautiful, just there. And you mentioned just in passing there the King James version, and of course its huge influence just on English. And you do mention, at least within the story of David, the King James version specifically more than any other later biblical translation. And I wonder what your relationship with it is yourself. When did you read it? Was it one of the first translations you encountered? There are parts of it that seem to be very dear for you, parts of it that have survived into your translation. And I wonder what the procedure was for a surviving verse. Is it one that is just frankly a very good translation? Or is it something just about the beauty of the term that if it isn't contradicted, ought to be kept?
Well, I suppose since I began reading the Bible in Hebrew when I was in my late teens, so I didn't do a lot of Bible reading in English, but probably the first translation, not that I read it end to end as William Faulkner claimed he did every year, but I don't quite believe that. But I certainly dipped into the King James Version first. Um, I didn't, well, when I was translating, our procedure was this. I would translate a piece of text, not looking at any other translation. And then if I was not quite happy with some of my word choices, I would look at a few translations, and sometimes on the level of a single word, I would adopt something from another translation, which I don't think qualifies as plagiarism. Now, once my translation has a certain resemblance to the King James because I follow the Hebrew syntax as they did. And by and large, in the narrative prose, they also followed the kind of homespun quality of the diction. So at least once I found I had translated a passage, and then I looked at the King James Version, and I saw one verse in which I had unwittingly replicated word for word the King James Version. It's a little like that famous Borges story, the Don Quixote of Pierre Menard, where uh, the Pierre Menard revises and revises his version of the Quixote, and in the end he comes out with a version that's uh, textually identical with the one that Cervantes wrote. But he says it's all
But
different because
superior.
I'm a symbolist poet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so now maybe I'll say a couple, maybe one way in which I part company from the King James Version. First,
Please.
there are a lot of errors in it, misconstruals of the Hebrew. But in a way, you can't quite fault them for that because the knowledge of biblical Hebrew in Christian Hebraeus in the early 17th century was imperfect. Uh, but there's something else, and that has to do with diction. That is, there are a lot of Latinate polysyllabic words in the King James Version, iniquity, abomination, and so forth. And I, for the most part, avoided those because, first of all, the Hebrew doesn't have a lot of polysyllabic words, and it breaks the rhythm of the original. So there, I definitely diverge from the King James.
And I wonder, just on that note, mentioning that the Borges story and accidentally translating a line identical to the King James, the kind of foundation myth of the Septuagint, of all of
Yes.
these scribes and scholars who all translated and came to the same exact Greek translation. And you do occasionally refer to the Septuagint or various editions of it. And I wonder the procedure there, translating from Greek, what your approach was.
Well, I didn't. Well, first of all, the story about the 70 sages who were locked in different rooms and came up with exactly, of course, that's legendary.
Yeah.
And as a translation, the Septuagint is quite literal. I am somewhat literal, but I always want to make the literal live happily with a readable literary English. Um, so I wasn't at all influenced in that way. And mainly, I wasn't reading the Septuagint, but in a scholarly edition of the Hebrew text, I was looking at the footnotes, which repeatedly show variants in the King James, in the Septuagint that don't that differ from the received text. Well, I'll give you one very clear-cut example. When Cain kills Abel, the received text, what's called the Masoretic text, reads like this. And Cain said to Abel, and then nothing follows. And in the next verse, he kills him. Now, there's something wrong with that because in every instance, when you have an X said to Y in the Hebrew text, direct speech follows, but there's nothing there. Now, the Septuagint evidently had a Hebrew text in front of it from which it translated, which said, and Cain said to Abel, let us go out to the field, which makes beautiful sense. He wants to get him away from people where he can kill him. So I adopted that. And there were other instances along the way.
Mm.
For my last question, I suppose, of this half before I hand over to Mr. Nabokov is a more general one. Earlier, you mentioned you thought or dreamed you might be a sort of athletic star, and we can imagine another world in which Robert Alter, the great football player, dreams about what if only I translated the Hebrew Bible, but I'll keep kicking these balls. But it's curious the way you came to translate the entire Hebrew Bible. As you say, you intended just to translate Genesis and then another and then another, and almost stumbled into it. And how do you find that now, looking back on it, that you have achieved one of the great feats of translation without setting out initially to achieve one of the great feats?
Okay, before I respond directly to that, I have to tell you something kind of amusing. My dearest friend for many years was a man named Michael Andre Bernstein, who was a brilliant scholar and late in his career turned to writing novels. And we were tennis partners for 25 years. We were both fanatically devoted to tennis. And at one point, he said to me, Bob, if you had your choice between writing, and then he named one of my books, and winning Wimbledon, which would you take? So I had to say, well, I think I would go for Wimbledon. Uh, but in any case, um, I undertook Genesis as a kind of experiment, which I thought was a rather quixotic experiment. Because I feel, well, I want to get uh, many of the stylistic values of the Hebrew into readable English. But a little voice in my head said, this isn't going to work because the structure of the two languages is different. Even the verb tenses are different. Many of the key terms of the Hebrew don't have good equivalents in English and so forth. So I said, I'm going to finish this, but in the end, people are going to hate it, and I might hate it. Um, anyway, it came out better than I thought, and it was very favorably reviewed both in the UK and in the US. So I thought, well, this isn't bad. I'll do one more text of the Bible, and that was the David story. Um, and by that time, I had built up a certain momentum. So I thought, okay, I want to do a few more books of the Bible. And I thought at the beginning, hey, now I'm going to do a translation of all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, I would have said, no way.
Starting
Um,
with Leviticus and Chronicles.
right. So
Yeah.
when I translated and published individual volumes, and at a certain point, maybe this was about 10 years ago, I looked over my shoulder at what I had done. I said, hey, it's 2/3. I think I can get it
Might as
through.
well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you started with prose. I wasn't quite aware of that. Because I first became aware of your translation through the poetic books, which, for my own personal taste, are the greatest triumphs. You bring out this gorgeous kind of alliterative rainbow of English to loads of texts that I already loved. I mean, the Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, some of the best stuff in previous Bible translations I'd read. But um, I really appreciated just the sheer musicality of the language, the attention to meter as well, because the King James, for all its beauty, is often the beauty of an extended line of prose.
Right, right.
Yes. Whereas a great example is God's answer out of the whirlwind in Job 38. I can't remember your precise line, but there's one I think in the King James in traditional translations it's something like "Who set the pillars of the earth," and you do some gorgeous alliteration with sockets and "In what were its sockets sunk?" Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who hedged the sea with double doors when it gushed forth from the womb? When I made cloud its clothing and thick mist its swaddling bands? Cloud clothing, double doors. In what were its
Sockets.
sockets sunk? Maybe I will edit this bit into the interview at the relevant moment. Yeah, I can't remember it exactly, but I really, really loved those moments in the poetry. I think that was the thing I loved. That you sort of came up to the challenge of all the best bits. It was almost like you went into gear, like, oh, I've really got to make sure this is gorgeous. Yeah.
Well, it's very gratifying that you respond in that way. Now, uh, a couple of people have asked me along the way, well, you're not a poet.
Mm.
How do you have the chutzpah to translate biblical poetry? And I don't have a simple answer to that. I mean, I've loved poetry as well as prose all my life. And I think I can say about myself that I've always been very sensitive to language. And I'll take the example of the Job poet. I think that he is an astounding poet. He's a poetic virtuoso. He commands this amazing range of Hebrew vocabulary that far exceeds that of any other biblical poet, and he has a wonderful sense of sound, of wordplay, a brilliant inventor of metaphors. So I kind of said to myself something like this: if I were the Job poet, but I happen to be writing my poetry in modern English. How would I do it so that it would be substantially the same as the Hebrew original? So it's almost a kind of fantasy exercise that is, for the moment, I'm a poet and I can do this. And I know for various reasons I've been recently had occasion to reread some of the poetic passages in my version of Job, and I thought that really hits the target.
In some ways, your whole attitude to the translation of the Bible, um, I thought leads us on quite nicely to your work on Nabokov. Your recent book on Nabokov, published a few years ago, called Nabokov on the Real World. The basic argument of the book is that this writer, Vladimir Nabokov, who's often seen as someone by his opponents as someone quite solipsistic, involved in sort of minute interior tasks, in his very attention to the plasticity of language, to the specificity of language, to these games that you can play with words, actually makes us more sensitive to the world around us. It doesn't cut us off as readers from the rest of the world, but makes us respond to it more thoroughly.
Well, Nabokov, of course, was a virtuoso stylist,
Mm,
and uh, an important part of the pleasure of reading him is the way he revels and invites you to revel in the language he uses, at the same time that the language is not just a game, but it's a way of opening up perspectives into the characters and their predicaments. And I would say that there's, as different as the style of the Hebrew Bible is from Nabokov's style, that there is a certain connection that is, the Hebrew writers paid a great deal of attention to language. It seems that it was something that was prominent in the culture.
mm,
For language was viewed as something that was very powerful. In the book of Proverbs, you have a number of proverbs with assertions like life and death are in the power of the tongue.
mm,
Um, so they invested a great deal of importance in language, but then they played with language for uh, purposeful reasons. For example, take Isaiah, who was the first Isaiah, not the ones who were added on, although they were quite good poets as well. But the first Isaiah, the one who lived in the 6th century BCE, wait a minute, I'm sorry, in the late 7th century BCE, into the 6th century, um, he was a great poet. And one of his moves as a poet was to juxtapose two words with opposite meanings to show how the perversion of values in the kingdom of Judah had uh, swung 180 degrees from the good to the bad.
mm.
For example, he says of the kingdom, uh, I'm going to say this in Hebrew first, and I'll
Please, yeah.
explain. Sarayich Sorerim. You can hear the alliteration. The first word is Sarayich means uh, your officers or your noblemen or something like that. The second word, so that's Sarayich. Sorerim means people who go wayward.
Mm,
So I translated it as your nobles are knaves,
mm,
getting the alliteration. So you can see that the fact that Isaiah as a poet uses alliteration uh, suggests that he's consciously is playing with language. But the play with language is very meaningful
Mm.
in the message that he's bringing to the subjects of the kingdom of Judah. And that combination of play with language and purposefulness is not dissimilar from the book for all the
Mm.
different.
And is that first poet of Isaiah the one who wrote in chapter 28, verse 10, the kind of famous nonsense
Oh yes.
Oh yeah,
verses?
yeah.
Vomit, vomit. What was in yours? It's a filth, pilth, filth, pilth, vomit, vomit,
Right,
vomit,
right,
vomit. Yeah.
right. And I translated with certain nonsense syllables.
Yeah.
If we have a moment, actually, I would be interested to hear just a bit more about that area. I mean, I know the King James is something like precept must be precept upon
Right,
precept,
right.
Mm,
and a lot of quite sensical dialogue, really, if you think about it, line upon
mm.
line. How do we get that from plink plonk, vomit mommet, and vice
Well,
versa?
I want to get the exact wording of my translation. So just
Yeah.
give me a moment and I'll flip to Isaiah 28. For all the tables were covered with vomit, filth with no. To whom will they teach knowledge, and to whom will they convey lessons? To the milk wean, to babes pulled from the breast, for it is filth, 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 vomit, 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 a little here, a little there. Okay. Uh, what
Mm,
the King James and I think other translations do is um, the uh, what I translate as filth pill is kav lekav tzav letzav in the Hebrew, and
okay.
those words have a meaning that is kav means line and tzav means okay precept or command, something like that.
Mhm,
So the King James translated, well, it's the Bible, so everything has to be meaningful.
mm,
So they translated according to the meaning of those monosyllabic words. But I think that that Isaiah has taken these words and used them to represent garbled nonsense. These
mm.
guys are dead drunk and they're vomiting,
Yes.
and that's why I did vomit, vomit, vomit.
Yeah. Um, going back to Nabokov and linking it to some of these translation decisions you're talking about. That was the psalm earlier, the dirge into dancing. What is it about alliteration and about rhyme that connects concepts in our heads? Do you have any idea about what curious psychological cause there is for these sorts of associations that people have between sounds and meanings?
Okay. Um, I'll begin with alliteration. That is, Nabokov, as you probably have noticed, loved
Yeah,
alliteration.
I loved the
Uh,
end of the warp and the web and the weft. The
right, right,
yeah, yeah, it's
exactly.
glorious. Yeah.
Now, years ago, a brilliant literary scholar at Yale, Benjamin Harshav, who was
Hmm.
a close friend of mine, uh, wrote a piece on does sound have meaning in
Mm,
poetry? And his contention was that it doesn't have any intrinsic meaning, but when sounds cohere, as in alliteration, it conveys to the reader a sense that there is something coherent and expressively emphatic about the text.
mm,
And I think that that's uh, the cautious way to say that um, to explain the effect of alliteration. Now, rhyme is a little bit different. Of course, there are a few ad hoc rhymes in the Bible, but there basically is no rhyming in the poetic system. Nabokov in Pale Fire, of course, pulled off this amazing trick. He wrote 999 lines of heroic couplets. That is
A
iambic
A B B
pentameter
C C. Yeah.
rhyming lines, and he made good poetry out of it. So the often rhyme is used to well to pull things together tightly. Well, let's see, the beginning of Shakespeare's 73rd sonnet. That time of year thou mayst to me behold when yellow leaves or or
None or few do
none or
hang.
few do hang against those boughs, did hang upon those boughs that hang against the cold.
Mm,
So so you have cold, behold.
mm,
Well, I think that is similar. That it's both the mnemonic,
mm.
and by the way, all systems of poetry are mnemonic.
Yeah.
That is, a dactylic hexameter in Homer is a mnemonic. The uh, semantic parallelism in biblical poetry is mnemonic, and preeminently, rhyme is a mnemonic. Now, at times, I'm not pulling a good example out of my sleeve.
Mm,
The the juxtaposition of two lines by a rhyme may either reinforce the meaning because the rhyme words are similar, or may make a point of contrast.
mm. Um,
And what do you think about just on that point? It's interesting how rhyming and alliteration is sometimes specific to the language, and obviously rhyme is curious because it depends a lot on a structure of a language.
Oh, it
Some say
does.
that English is a tough one to rhyme because we have so many kind of hidden vowel sounds that true rhymes are pretty rare. You get all these half rhymes that are almost there, and you kind of, whereas Italian, everything, you've got so many true rhymes. You can have these sort of triple rhymes easily, constantly. So when you're trying to translate Orlando Furioso, you've got quite a tough challenge on your hand. And I think
Right.
people like Alexander Pope, who Pale Fire is obviously influenced by his poetry, he was following languages other than English, who might be more naturally inclined. Whereas Old English went for alliteration as its kind of
Right, right.
primary motivation, much like the Hebrew. So maybe there is this kind of a touching ground between quite distinct languages.
yeah,
Oh,
But yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, it's interesting how English poetry really comes into its own through alliteration. I mean, the first like great masterpieces in Middle English, Gawain and the Green Knight, and Piers Plowman, and so on. Not Chaucer, but like lots of the poets of that medieval period. That's the bedrock. Not pentameter, not meter, but yeah, these alliterative lines.
Now, I'll give you an extreme example of rhyming that is language specific.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Medieval Arabic poetry, and I do not read Arabic, but I know about it, and medieval Hebrew poetry, which of which I'm an avid reader. There was great poetry in Hebrew in
looks like a connection error in the middle of such an interesting point. Where was it going? The Arabic, the Hebrew,
But
the
yeah, yeah. What? I wonder what medieval Hebrew poetry's like. The
great,
best
I've
form
heard.
yet. Yeah. Have you started rereading Pale Fire?
Necessarily, yeah.
Yeah,
Read the poem again, through the
yeah.
forward. It's better the second time,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, I've
but also great the first time in a different and irreplicable way.
Yeah.
Because the first time, not seeing all of those things points you in a certain direction. The second time, you
Yes.
just see them all. Like the first time he encounters John Shade, he falls on the floor and assumes this is what released the car from its icy trap. And just
Yes.
this assumption of his importance in John Shade's life is starts
Yeah.
at this random incident.
Oh,
Ah,
Robert Alter's back.
mm, this
Show
is the
the
man.
butterflies out.
Yeah, the
Uh,
butterflies have done the trick.
My apologies. I didn't realize my computer was unplugged and the battery ran down.
no, no problem.
So
You were
Welcome back.
talking about medieval Hebrew poetry, which we're bursting to learn about.
right.
Yeah.
Well, uh, because of basically suffixes and other features of the language in classical Arabic and certainly in Hebrew, which I know firsthand, it's very easy to rhyme. And so the system that the Hebrew poets inherited from the Arab poets was monorhymes. So you could write a poem of 150 lines with a single rhyme from beginning to end.
Wow.
Anybody who tried to do that in English would be insane. Okay?
Challenge accepted. I-
I think you'd have to do it by sort of subtly morphing half rhymes. So it
yes.
wouldn't be able to be a true rhyme, but you kind of slowly transform the rhyme until it's somewhere very different from where you began.
Yeah.
Right. That's one. Actually, my oldest son, Dan Alter, is a poet.
Oh,
He
okay.
knows Hebrew well, and he recently did a selection of the four major poets in Hebrew in the Middle Ages, and it reads very well, and it's pieces. A few of the poems have been snatched up by editors of journals, but it's looking for a publisher right now. But he abandoned rhyme entirely, but he
Yeah.
tried to make them into good English poems.
Yeah, I'm translating Josef von Eichendorff at the moment, the German Romantic poet,
Oh, you
and
really?
yes, and I'm retaining rhyme, not because I think it's necessary to communicate the effect, but just for the joy of the difficulty,
Uh-huh. Okay.
and the surprises. I think even when you have to mistranslate, and sometimes you must mistranslate in order
Right.
to retain rhyme, it throws up some interesting, almost hidden truths within the original poem. I mean, the very act of reading, you say in your book on Nabokov, actually, is almost an act of translation in itself. I mean, every literary work, even in a language one can understand, must be inwardly translated
Right.
before by each of its readers as well, by each individual human being as an island, and all these translations are necessarily mistranslations. Only the relative absurdity of them can be a sort of bellwether. But Pale Fire experiments with this sensibility quite a lot with the fake Zemblin the Shakespeare translators who
Yeah.
clearly one of the funniest parts of the book we have
Right.
this.
So
Yeah.
Kinbo doesn't recognize that the phrase pale fire
Yes.
appears in Shakespeare because he only has the Semblin translation.
Yeah, and the Zambian translator's last words are, how do you say to die in English, but in
Yeah.
French?
Yeah. He says it in French.
Yeah.
Comment on dit mourir en anglais?
Yeah, one of the things that struck me that it's my second time reading Pale Fire. I read it a decade ago. Enjoyed it much, much more this time. And one of the things that struck me so much this time on the read through was just how funny it is,
Oh, it is.
which is quite an extraordinary feat to pull off while simultaneously being so beautiful. It's one of the great mysteries of the book to me, and is that it's not merely simultaneously funny and sad, like something like Kafka, like Beckett, like so much
Yeah.
of the 20th century literature, but it's funny and beautiful, like rapturously so, like a Botticelli painting, which I can't think of another like another analog to. Um, is one of the great joys going through this time, and also this time after reading it in a way that lined up very much with the argument of your book. I found myself much more sensitive to my own senses, to the reality. I bit into an apple the other day, and the
Yeah.
specific way that the juice went into my mouth, I was hearing it almost as an experience in Nabokovian prose.
That's great.
Yeah, it did the what the Russian formalist dream is of literature, namely to make reality real again, to to make
Right,
stone stony, to make stars starry, to
right,
make
right.
ourselves most like ourselves. Um, maybe it's also one of the things that's so powerful about the book now, reading it now, is living in a reality that's so abstracted from reality. Um, that I mean, it's quite crazy reading these people writing in the 1930s talking about, oh, we don't live in real reality anymore. We live in
Mhm.
this artificial world, and we need to re-enchant reality through language. Um, I'm saying this in an artificial space, having spent a whole day using artificial means of communication. Yeah, I'm rambling a little.
No,
Um,
but that's right. I mean,
yeah,
look, the fact that the kids are all glued to their screens, and as many people have pointed out, the interaction between the kid and the screen has, to an alarming extent, displaced interaction with other people. Is a perfect illustration of what you say.
mm, yeah, and uh, you focus quite a bit in the book on the mistrust that various political or authoritarian regimes have to Nabokov, not merely in the Soviet Union, but also a sort of a creeping like authoritarianism in sort of American university campuses that is suspicious of aesthetics for its own sake.
Mhm.
Could you speak a bit about this? Mm.
Well, Nabokov, of course, escaped from two totalitarian regimes.
Yes.
First, after the Russian Revolution from the Soviets, and then after Hitler took power from the Nazis. So he was uh, deeply concerned for the rest of his life how an authoritarian political system could deny the freedom of individual consciousness, which for him was the bedrock of any kind of decent human existence. And the you probably know that he wrote two novels that were directly about tyrannical
Yeah,
regimes.
I
Ben,
didn't read your essays on them because I've not read the novels and I want them
oh,
to be
okay.
a surprise when I do read them. But yes.
Yeah, Ben Sinister and Invitation to
Mm.
Be. They're well worth reading.
Hmm. Yeah, well, after how much I enjoyed Pale Fire this time, I think I'm probably going to dive into a complete works.
Okay, I
No.
made a convert.
Yeah, and I really was
Yeah.
a convert as well. I remember being frustrated with Pale Fire the first time I read it. Even more frustrated with Lolita There's a moment in Lolita quite late in the book where the narrator says, "Oh, I need hardly explain to the attentive reader who sat there on the chair in front of me." And I had no idea who on earth it could be. And I was furious. I,
Yes, he really liked attentive readers, and of course, he liked playing chess games with his readers.
yes. Um, and yeah, why do you think? Why is why does attention to language create the kind of individual consciousness that would be not permissible in a totalitarian state? Why is that?
That's a good question. Well, I would say something like this. We are language using animals, and uh, to a large extent, consciousness expresses itself through through language, I'm sorry, in a singular. Of course, it expresses itself through dance, through music. It's not exclusive, but language seems to be quite primary. And the the ability to choose your words um, to on a very primary level, Nabokov always complained that we had crude words for red, blue, yellow, and so forth, where there were nuances of colors, and there's magenta, and there's dove blue, which you like to use, various others. Um, and authoritarianism standardizes and distorts language. There's a, a memorable essay by George Orwell, which you probably know,
Yes.
about what happens to the German language under Nazism, where, uh, say, mass murder becomes the final solution. The word murder is
Mm.
uh, never appears, and so forth. So the the struggle. So you might say uh, the free use of language, using language to try to name things accurately, whether it's colors or emotions or something like love and so forth, is the ultimate bastion of freedom against totalitarianism, according to Nabokov.
Mm. It's quite interesting to contrast him to George Orwell, whose prose style is quite austere.
Yes, it is.
He said good prose is like a window pane. When you're reading George Orwell, you're never thinking about how he's writing. You're just thinking about what he's saying, and that's designedly so. And in the famous pieces of advice that he gives to writers in his most famous essay, Politics in the English Language, most of these pieces of advice he gives, which are towards austerity, towards short words where long words will do,
Yeah.
towards refraining from using foreign words. Nabokov breaks almost all of these
Right.
rules on almost every single page. Um, he's
It's a just great, just to interject there, great that you mentioned it's like a window pane, the false azure in the window pane
yeah.
of pale
Right.
fire, that being the whole idea of Nabokov. He can do that, whereas for Orwell, it's just looking through the window pane.
Right.
Whereas
Mm,
it seems like for Nabokov, it's looking at the window and seeing the reflection behind you. But
Actually,
continue.
Orwell's agenda is rather close to my agenda in translating the prose of the Hebrew Bible.
mm, yeah. Um, But it is just because it's interesting that they both have a similar relationship towards totalitarianism. I suppose not Nabokov was more of a liberal individualist, and George Orwell was a democratic socialist. So there's differences there, but in their opposition to totalitarianism and in the way they both thought that literature was an important, if not the most important means of combating it. Um, yeah, I find it interesting that for Nabokov you can subvert Nazism just by naming a shade of blue.
Yeah.
Whereas for Orwell you have to, it's explicit. You must, he's writing using the words Nazism and communism and
Right.
these abstractions, which Nabokov seems quite impatient with. He doesn't really play any ideological games. It seems to be much more, no, just concentrate on the immediate experience, and through that you will have a subversive effect.
That's aptly put. And
Mm.
there's a wonderful anecdote about Nabokov. When he came to the United States, he was introduced to Mary McCarthy. And of course, like well, I should say most American intellectuals, especially literary intellectuals at the time, she was very political and on the left. So she said, I am interested in meeting you, Mr. Nabokov, as a white Russian. He said, Madam, I am not a white Russian. He said, are you a democratic socialist? No, madam, I'm not a democratic socialist. And she went through another three or so ideological options. And then he said, Madam, I am a Russian liberal.
Um, and uh, yeah, it's interesting. This distancing from all possible terms that one could use, and almost finding those terms anathema to
Right,
this
exactly.
highest
Yeah,
goal of individual consciousness, the sort of end goal of reality to Nabokov.
that's
Someone like George Orwell doesn't have an end goal of reality. It's just about specific social ills of the time, whether that's homelessness or social
right.
inequality
Yeah.
or totalitarianism. Whereas Nabokov is, what does a free individual in a free society do? What are they striving towards? Yeah. Um, the refusal to contemplate the political realm in Nabokov is sometimes uncomfortable for some people, especially when it comes to the things he was writing in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Um, um, and similarly with other modernist writers like James Joyce, who was famously upset that the Second World War might interrupt the publication schedule of Finnegan's Wake.
Right,
Um,
right.
that's the sort of main issue for him. Um, why do you think Nabokov is still? What about him do you think is not necessarily taking a cowardly stance, just backing away? Why do you think his stance actually has something more, if not heroic, then at least sort of noble about it?
Well, I think it's for the reasons that we've uh, pretty much touched on. That is, he sees a world around him in which there are all kinds of conformisms. There's ideological conformism. Then there's the conformism of mass market consumers.
Mhm.
There is the uh, uh, conformism of devout Freudians, as you know, he despised Freud. And so, in a dozen different ways, through his novels, and you can see it explicitly in his interviews. He's saying, no, we can't just be going lockstep with a lot of other people. We have to experience the world as our own individual selves, and not yield to formulas, not yield to convention.
Mm. Which
That has it has an interesting reflection just with Pale Fire, which is like an extreme of that example.
yes.
People living in such an individual universe that they construct their own, they make their own Zembla. And in
Mm.
a way, I mean, the character of Charles, I don't find him completely despicable. There's something I admire about his complete historical understanding of his
Yeah.
own universe and that he's so confident in his interpretation of the poem and the tension. And I was thinking about, in fact, the tension in the Hebrew Bible between the contradictions that exist and the attempt to harmonize them, but then the editors being reluctant to actually change the text. So we'll link it together, the lyre player and the slayer of giants, but we won't
Yeah,
actually change it because we can't do that. But we
Yeah.
can accept a world in which there are some contradictions. And then you have Charles Kimbote or Kimbote as he reflects on the poem by John Shade, and he's disappointed that it doesn't fulfill his fantasies as much as he thought it would. But in that acknowledgement, he's accepting there is a sort of objective reality, and then there's his sub reality, and the two are balanced together. And I think you could say in his case, overbalanced into the
right.
fantasy,
Yeah.
but not completely. He could just have completely rewritten the poem. He
Right.
could pretend all kinds of things, but he does have a standard of truth.
Yeah, there are some admissions at the end that, maybe I'm not a king. Maybe I should be in
Yeah.
a psych ward. Yeah. I
Yeah, and that oh,
I
no,
find
go on.
him quite an admirable character by the end as well. In some ways it
Well,
follows
one
the
sympathizes with him. Yeah.
yeah, it follows the trajectory of Don Quixote, Quixote. I've only ever seen this word written
Guilty.
down. Where he starts as a figure of total hilarity and fun. The first few books of Don Quixote, I'm pretty sure Cervantes was in the mode of pure parody. But by
Mm.
the end of Don Quixote, he is an extremely moving figure whose crazy way of seeing the world does actually have something that speaks to the inner longing of every human being.
Right, right.
Um, maybe windmills are indeed giants, and everyone else is just seeing them incorrectly. And
Right,
in the
right,
same way, Kimbote, by the end, has like maybe it's my own taste, but has created the superior literary work. I like
right.
the poem, but the notes
Yeah,
are the
they're amazing.
lifeblood.
They are.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if I can go back for a minute to what you were saying about
Please.
the accommodation of contradictions in the Hebrew Bible,
Mm.
it goes beyond the splicing together of contradictory sources, as in the David story. It's built into the whole structure of the Hebrew Bible because you can see that late biblical books that basically vehemently contradict the consensus views of the earlier Hebrew books are accommodated and become part of the canon. Okay, Genesis starts with a preeminently anthropocentric view of reality, right? Man is the crown of creation. He is enjoined to uh, hold sway over all things. And then you get to Job. And in the voice from the whirlwind, uh, humanity sits up in the upper bleachers, looking down at this vast panorama of creation, which is beyond his ken.
Yeah. It seems
And yet
like
they thought that belonged in the canon.
yeah, it's astonishing. I know the literary critic Harold Bloom thought that literary quality must have been the at least one of the main criteria for selection, like before any sort of budding theologies come in there. And when with texts like the Song of Songs, Job, Ecclesiastes, or Qoheleth, you do see that they are so scandalous to the conception of God, of man's relationship with God, or in the case of the Song of Songs, kind of a bit of a curveball. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything else in the
Right.
Hebrew Bible, but clearly people, just because of their literary power, um, could not imagine these being expunged from the work.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, I don't often agree with Harold Bloom, but I agree with him emphatically on this,
I
that there were books of the Hebrew Bible which, in terms of their content, should not have been included. And another example is Ecclesiastes, or as we tend to call it these days, Kohelet,
could have it.
uh,
That's it. Yeah.
which certainly with its vision of futility of all futility, I'm sorry, of all endeavor, and the cyclical repetition of things is nothing like what you have in earlier biblical texts. But there was something profound about the challenging view of reality it posed, but also something beautiful about the prose poetry of the book. And people thought, we can't give this up, let's keep it. And of course, in that case, they kept it by sticking on an editorial addendum at the end, which is very
By the
polite.
way,
Yeah,
obey the commandments,
right.
whatever it is. Yeah, yeah. One of the great accidental comedy moments in the Hebrew
Yeah,
Bible.
right. I
But
like that.
it's one of the and it reminds me, it happens a few times, but a film by Murnau, The Last Laugh, 1920s
Oh
German
yeah,
silent
yeah,
film,
I
which
vaguely remember, yeah.
has
yeah.
an extraordinarily grim ending in
The
which
the
this
grimmest ending
the
of all
grimmest
time.
ending
Yeah,
ever, and then you get a title card saying, if this were a true story, it would have ended here. And then you get this whole epilogue where he like wins the lottery and everything's great forever.
Right.
But the
Yeah,
sheer
that's the same
ridiculousness
thing. You're
yeah.
right.
of the appended end, that it actually makes the sadder ending sadder because you don't believe that the ending at the end. You don't
Of
believe the
course.
epilogue. It's so absurd. You're like, oh God, that really was bleak. And I think the
Yeah.
same of The Apartment, the 1960s
The Jack
film, where
Lemmon. Yeah.
you have the really sad ending where they part ways, and then you get the kind of sad ending where they're together playing cards at the end. But I think the one you believe is given relief by the one you kind of don't believe. So maybe
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes is even more powerful for them being presented with this sort of like, oh, well, that's the answer to life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I'd let's just wind up the chat here. It was a real pleasure talking to you, Robert. Thank you so much for making the time. Um, just as a final sort of statement, what do you think of the trajectory, just outside of the Bible, outside of Nabokov, the trajectory of present American fiction? What do you think is the general trajectory? What are your trepidations? What are your hopes for it? Hmm.
Well, I think it's not at the peak that it was a generation ago when you had Updike and Philip Roth. Both of them are certainly uneven, but at their best are brilliant novelists, and Saul Bellow.
Yeah, I love
Uh,
Soul Bellow. What a yeah.
yeah, I don't think that there are there are fairly interesting American novelists, but I don't think they're quite at that level. And actually, I think that British and Irish novelists are at a higher level. I'm a great admirer of John Banville, of Ian McEwan, and a few others.
Hmm.
I'd like to append one quick question, which we asked our
Okay.
last guest,
Yeah.
which is if you could add a text to the biblical canon, perhaps on the level of its aesthetic accomplishment, you could just slip one in there, and that's in forever, a new Maccabees or whatever. What what would you pick?
Well, it would have to be an ancient text.
Non-ancient, anything you please,
Anything.
and all councils will agree with you. They'll say, of course it is inspired.
Okay, I would say Kafka's The Trial,
Yeah.
Oh, an interesting
Yeah.
last book of the.
which might have, I think, does have a definite connection with the Book of Job,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
and uh, Gershom Scholem, the great historian of Jewish mysticism, in I think it was in an interview, said that for him there are three great canonical texts, which are the Hebrew Bible, the Zohar, the great text of the Kabbalah,
Mm.
and the novels of Kafka.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. I'll go read some Kafka after the Nabokov binge. Yeah. Pleasure speaking with you, Robert. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank
Thank
you
you
for
very
your
much.
time.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I have to say that you are probably the best informed and most intelligent of the interviewers that I've had over the years.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Huge compliment.
Okay. Well, it's evening where you are. Enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Nice
very
glass of
much.
wine. Bye bye.
Bye bye.